Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining WTS Central Virginia chapter for our speaker series on building Virginia's electric vehicle infrastructure. I'm Muriel Rodriguez with Schnabel Engineering and chapter president. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize our annual sponsors. Our benefactor sponsors are CDM Smith, Dovetail Cultural Resource Group, and Schnabel Engineering. Our platinum sponsors are ATCS, Kimley Horn, Moffitt and Nickel, and Search. Our gold sponsors, Wallace Montgomery, Wolpert, Volkert, and our silver sponsor, WSP. Thank you to all of our sponsors. We really appreciate your support. Just one announcement. Our annual awards reception is going to be held on September the 28th at the Virginia War Memorial. This is always a wonderful event, and we get to recognize and honor our award recipients. Among our winners will be the Chief Deputy Commissioner at VDOT, Kathy McGee, who is being celebrated as Woman of the Year. Registration opens next week, so please mark your calendars. We hope to see you at the memorial. If you've never been there before, this is a beautiful location downtown overlooking the James River. So now I'd like to introduce our panel for today's presentation and let them tell us a little bit about themselves. First up is going to be Mr. Brad Shelton, Transportation Planning Manager at Michael Baker. Brad?
Thanks, Muriel. Sure. So I manage our transportation planning team out of Michael Baker's Richmond office. Prior to coming to Michael Baker, I worked in the public sector at both the state, local, and regional level. And Muriel said we should add in a little fun fact about ourselves. So for me, I spend an inordinate amount of my free time coaching youth sports that I know absolutely nothing about. So I'm hoping to demonstrate a little bit more expertise in electric vehicles than I typically do in girls basketball today.
Great. Thank you, Brad. Next is Angel Deem, Chief of Policy at VDOT. Angel?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon. Yep, afternoon now, everyone. Angel Deem, I'm VDOT's Chief of Policy. Unlike Brad, I've spent my entire career in the public sector working for VDOT. I like to tell folks that, because it's true, that I started here as an intern and just never left. There were so many exciting things for me within the environmental arena at VDOT that, it was just a great opportunity for me to move around and learn, and I'm very honored to be in the role I have today. And so under the Chief of Policy at VDOT, I have the governance and legislative sections, as well as environmental, right-of-way, and local assistance. So really expanding my purview a bit. So I'm happy to be with you guys today. Electric vehicles is something fairly new for me. I've been on a crash course for the last 6 or 8 months, it feels like. Yeah, and in terms of fun facts, I struggled a bit with this one, but I saw in your slide deck a visit to the plant house. I love that place. And so plants are definitely a hobby for me. It helps me to stay calm, and I have probably at least my daughters tell me I have way too many plants at the house. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Angel. And now I'd like to introduce Laura Schewel. She's the co-founder and CEO of Streetlight Data. Laura?
Hello. I'm Laura. As was said, I'm at Streetlight Data, now a division within Jacobs. I'm in our Richmond office. My background is, of course, data for transportation, but before Streetlight, I was working on vehicle electrification strategy for the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as at Rocky Mountain Institute before that, which is a think tank on energy things. My fun fact, since this is the Central Virginia chapter of WTS, is that my great-great-grandfather immigrated to America and started a little furniture cart that is now a group of furniture stores within Central Virginia. And as of the pandemic, we believe it is now the 3rd oldest family-run furniture stores in America. So Central Virginia has been a big supporter of the Schewel Furniture brand.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so just as a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we will try to answer those at the end of the program. But for now, I'm going to start the program with you, Brad.
Great, thank you. Let's see, you able to see my slides?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, thanks. So I'm going to kind of kick things off today to really kind of give an introduction to vehicle electrification and really kind of set the stage for Angel and Laura's presentations that are going to follow. With Michael Baker, we support the development of the Virginia Electric Vehicle Transportation Readiness Study for the Virginia Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment. So some of what you'll see today are some takeaways from that study. But really just to give you a good introduction to electrification, the vehicles, and the charging infrastructure. So we'll start with why do we have electric vehicles? Why do we want to electrify? And the short answer is the environmental benefits. Electric vehicles typically have a smaller carbon footprint and reduced greenhouse gas emissions over the life cycle of the vehicle than traditional gasoline-powered cars. And when we think about the carbon footprint, it's smaller even when we account for the electricity used for charging. The graphic you see on the right that was developed by Yale Climate Connections illustrates that even if you were to charge an electric vehicle with a coal-fired power plant for its entire life cycle, it still reduces energy use by 31% versus a gasoline-powered vehicle. On the greenhouse gas emission side, yes, electric vehicles do have a larger impact at the time of manufacturing due to the materials that go into the battery production. However, due to the lack of tailpipe emissions over the life cycle of the car, you still come out ahead versus a gasoline-powered vehicle. Electric vehicles are more versatile than ever nowadays. The vehicles that we see today now have more than enough typical range for average use in the US. Typical range for an electric vehicle for those that are on the market today is about 240 miles of range, and we're seeing that number increase really year over year. When you think about how 68% of commuters in America travel 15 miles or less for a commute, and really only 11% commute more than 30 miles, electric vehicles really can meet the need for most commuters in the US. We have a variety of model types available today, so they're not simply subcompact, but we have larger vehicles, four-door vehicles, vehicles that can haul the whole family around and the dog. And we even have luxury models available and sports cars available. So there's models to fit just about every interest. The vehicles can be charged from a standard outlet. While we're going to talk about electric vehicle infrastructure today, the reality is most people charge at home. And unless you're on a road trip or you're taking a long trip somewhere, most of your charging is going to happen at your home site. Electric vehicles also have the advantage of having reduced operational costs at about 4 cents a mile compared to 12 cents a mile for a internal combustion engine vehicle or an ICE. And that's attributed to not only the cost in fuel, electricity being cheaper than gasoline, but also electric vehicles don't have as many moving parts. They don't have parts that wear out. They don't have oil. They don't have hoses and belts that have to be replaced. So all that amounts to cost savings for the vehicle owner over the life cycle of the vehicle. So when we talk about electric vehicles, there's typically 3 types that we talk about that are available on the market today. The first is the hybrid electric vehicle, and this is, I think, most people think of the Prius as the poster child for the hybrid electric. And with the hybrid electric, we do have an internal combustion engine combined with an electric motor, and it uses the energy stored in a battery to essentially increase the mileage of that vehicle. The batteries in these vehicles are charged by regenerative braking, so you don't have to plug these vehicles in. The next type of vehicle we have is the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, which is similar to the hybrid, except the battery pack is larger and the electric motors are larger. And these vehicles can actually travel between 20 to 40 miles solely on electric power. So for a lot of folks, they can have their entire commute completed on electric energy with these vehicles and only need the gas energy when they're taking longer trips. These do have to be plugged in to be charged, however. And then finally, we have the all-electric vehicle or the battery electric vehicle, which is what most people think of when we talk about electric vehicles. These have much larger battery packs than the hybrids. runs solely off an electric motor, have to be plugged in to be charged using charging equipment. And the typical range can vary between 150 to 400 miles. As I mentioned earlier, the average in the U.S. right now is 240 miles for the vehicles available. And when we look at how many vehicles we have on the road today, looking at national figures from December of 2020, we had about 1 million electric vehicles registered in the U.S., about 500,000 plug-in hybrids, and just shy of 5 million hybrid electrics. So quite a few on the road today. And then we look at the sales by model over the last about 10 years. You can see that the sales have really grown exponentially, especially in 2018 with the introduction of the Tesla Model 3, which is the blue bar that you see kind of the top third of that bar. So we can see there's quite a bit of demand out there, and folks are purchasing vehicles in large quantities. So in 2019, if we look at our plug-in hybrid sales, in 2019, the most recent data we have available, we had just shy of 85,000 units sold nationally, with the Prius Prime plug-in hybrid leading the way. And then if we look at our battery electrics, significantly more battery electrics were sold at just under 242,000 units, with the Tesla Model 3 leading the way. And one thing you don't see on those previous slides are pickup trucks. So it's important to note that there's new segments still being electrified. While there's a lot of offerings out there today where the advances in the battery technology are allowing us to electrify different segments, and the pickup truck is the hot item right now. And that's important to note because the Ford F-150 is the #1 selling vehicle in North America. So we see our stalwarts like Ford, Chevy, GMC jumping on this bandwagon, and then we have our upstarts. You can call Tesla an upstart, but Tesla, Rivian, Canoo, and Lordstown are also jumping in the game. So we're going to see a lot more of the electric pickups on the roads. If we look at the registrations by state, no surprise here, California has the most electric vehicles registered at 563,000, followed by Florida and Texas. However, Virginia's not far behind. We're number 11 with a little over 30,000 electric vehicles registered in Virginia. So the electric vehicles here are here, but we're going to see them increase. As part of the Transportation Funding Sustainability Report that was developed by the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment here in Virginia in 2019, they had independent forecasts conducted for electric vehicle market penetration rates, and they were showing forecast adoption rates between 28% and 60% on those forecasts. But the key takeaway here is all those numbers are going up and exponentially so. So the demand is there today, and it's just going to increase looking out into the future. So with all these vehicles on the road and expected to be on the road, we need to figure out a way to charge them. So we'll talk about charging types. We typically have 3 levels of charging. Level 1 charging is your standard 120 volt charger, your household outlet. This is also referred to as a trickle charger because it could take really a day or longer to bring a vehicle to a full charge. Level 2 charging is the next step up. At 240 volts, you can charge an electric vehicle in about half a day on a level 2 charger. A lot of people who own electric vehicles will install these at their homes. You'll also find these often at places like office complexes or apartment buildings, hotels, places where people will leave a vehicle for 6 to 8 hours at a time. And then the third level is the DC fast charging at 480 volts. You can charge an electric vehicle in an hour, sometimes even less, depending on the vehicle type. And these are typically what you'll see at your gas stations. Your Tesla supercharger is a DC fast. And with each one of these, we have to make sure we're using the right plug type and accommodating for the right plug type. So with level 2 charging, there's 2 plugs available. Tesla has their proprietary destination charger. If you're not driving a Tesla, then you're using the J1772 standard. And then for DC fast charging, again, Tesla has their own proprietary supercharger. But then for everyone else, you're either using a CCS or a CHAdeMO plug. And the CHAdeMO is really, we're really seeing that phase out. Nissan, I think, was the last really large manufacturer to use it. They're switching over to CCS. So we're seeing CCS really becoming the predominant plug type moving forward. So CHAdeMO looks like it's going to become kind of the Betamax of DC fast chargers, if you're old enough to understand that reference, but we're kind of seeing that phase out. If we look at the number of chargers that we have in the US, and this is 2020 data, we had at the time of January 2020, we had 28,000 electric vehicle chargers in the US with 90,000 ports. And again, if you look at the green line of ports especially, you see that number growing exponentially. So quite amount of increased investment in these charging stations as demand has increased. And if we break it down by DC fast chargers, level 2 chargers, and level 1 chargers, you see that same scenario repeat itself. And especially if you look at the number of DC fast chargers that have been installed in the last 2 years of this data set in 2018, 2019, we're seeing more investment in those DC fast chargers. And again, if we take a statewide, a state-by-state look at who the leaders are, no surprise here, again, California is the leader, followed by New York and Florida. And in 2021, Virginia ranked 11th in the number of charging stations with just over 1,100, and we ranked 10th in charging outlets with just over 3,300. Now, as part of the electric vehicle readiness study that we performed for the state of Virginia, we did map all of our charging stations and do some analysis on them. And this is our CCS charging locations, which you can see the green dots are primarily clustered in our urban areas, Northern Virginia, Richmond, Hampton Roads, with also some chargers on the 64 corridor and the 81 corridor. Anywhere that you see a red line on this map indicates where there's a 50-mile stretch of interstate that's without a charging station. So we identify those as gaps to be addressed. We look at our level 2 charging stations. We have quite a few of these in Virginia, again, concentrated in the urban crescent of Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hampton Roads. But we see some more of these in some of our more rural areas, such as Lynchburg, Danville, and also on the I-81 corridor. We talk a lot about light duty vehicles with electric when we talk about electrification, but it's also important to not forget the importance of additional applications in the medium and heavy duty segment. When we talk about trucks, delivery vehicles, school buses, transit buses, and in fact, we have some electric transit pilots going on in Virginia as we speak in Alexandria and Hampton Roads. And it's important to make sure we're including these segments in our plans because research has shown that our communities of color are disproportionately exposed to vehicle exhaust pollution. And a major source of this is that diesel exhaust in these neighborhoods, as these neighborhoods are serviced by delivery vehicles, transit buses, trucks. So by electrifying the segments that are serving these neighborhoods, we can help to reduce their exposure to pollution as well. So as we look ahead, we want to make sure we're continuing to provide education on the benefits of electric vehicles. We certainly need to continue to invest in our charging network and encourage private sector investment in that charging network, since frankly, a lot of these facilities are going to have to be installed on private property. So we need those private sector partners. We need to make sure that underserved populations are included in our electrification plans. Electrification is for everyone. And we need to think beyond passenger vehicles so that everyone can be rewarded by the benefits that come in clean air when you're serviced by electric vehicles. So from there, I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to Angel.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, you seeing my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Not in presentation.
We still
I'm
got
sorry?
the orange. We still got the orange bar, Angel.
Oh my Lord. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Well, thanks, Brad. That was a great overview. And I'm going to sort of pivot off of that to exactly what's happening, how we're charging ahead, if you will, with the NEVI program. So that's the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. So that's going to be my primary focus and how Virginia is responding to that. So just by way, again, of background and building on what you already heard from Brad, passenger vehicle emissions clearly are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. What you see in the chart there is from the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality from their 2018 greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And of course, that's being updated now. But on-road transportation typically is hovering around 30% by sector. So clearly transportation makes up a large share of greenhouse gas emissions. And within transportation, passenger vehicles, of course, are our focus. And we think that's where we really have the opportunity. So transportation electrification being a real essential tool to decarbonize transportation and reduce those emissions going forward. So again, Virginia, the status in Virginia. So lots of data in this sector, depending how you want to look at it and slice and dice it. But Virginia, for another ranking, Virginia is 13th nationally in EV sales. So that's really good news. There's also, so that shows us that there's increasing demand, but also there's increasing supply as automakers make commitments and investments towards electrification, as you just heard about. There's still some supply chain challenges, but that is still on the rise. And then specifically in Virginia, I believe we're advantaged in this arena from some very recent and relevant legislation that's passed. So we have the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which requires net zero emissions economy-wide by 2045. So we'll be participating, of course, in that along with our other state agency partners. There's the Advanced Clean Cars rule, which will ensure increasing numbers of EVs are sold within the Commonwealth starting in 2024. And then this most recent legislative session, we have the Department of General Services now being required to use what's called a total cost of ownership calculator. So when they're going to purchase fleet vehicles, they have to do an analysis to show what that total cost of ownership is and purchase EV unless it can be demonstrated that a gas vehicle has that lower cost of ownership, or a case can be made that there isn't a suitable EV available for the use. So that's all good news. And as we look at Virginia's EV charging infrastructure, so this is using the same data set that you already saw in the previous slide deck, about 1,100 public charging stations in Virginia with 3,300 ports. And then we're looking specifically as part of the NEVI program at those fast chargers, the DCFCs. So based on our analysis, we think we're around 139 of those stations that have those fast chargers. And that's really important as we look at the NEVI program requirements. So this graphic actually comes from the readiness study that Brad mentioned. So we were very thankful to have that information at our disposal as we moved into the NEVI program. So that was very recent background information for us. It told us that range anxiety and difficulty in finding an available charging station, not only finding a station, but finding a station that's up and running, those are the two primary reasons or barriers that folks identify when they're making that decision to purchase electric. And so recommendations from that study include, continuing to build out the infrastructure to ensure that we have that convenient, reliable, and affordable access. So very much in line with the NEVI program goals, which rolled out this year. So NEVI is authorized by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, to strategically deploy EV charging infrastructure and establish an interconnected national charging network. So the goal there being 500,000 of these chargers nationwide by 2030. So pretty aggressive goal. It's a formula funded program. In Virginia, we aim to receive just over 100 million over the 5-year span of those funds to support EV charging infrastructure. So VDOT is the lead because the funds flow from Federal Highway through VDOT, but we're working very closely with the Secretary of Transportation's office and certainly under their direction. So a little bit about the NEVI program and the specific requirements for accessing these funds. The program requires installation or upgrade of publicly accessible fast chargers. And there are also requirements around where these chargers are located. So within a mile of the interstate, every 50 miles with 4 ports at an individual station, and each port's providing 150 kilowatts. So when we look at that distribution of existing infrastructure, not everything meets these requirements. And the program also provides 5 years of operations and maintenance funding in addition to the initial capital investment. So in Virginia, we are focused on having third parties come in and acquire, install, own, operate, and maintain these stations. Not to say that we won't consider some public ownership, but we're primarily focused on driving the private sector in this arena. So what does that interconnected national charging network look like? This is what it looks like. So this map represents the alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs, across the country. So AFCs are nominated by individual states and then approved by the Federal Highway Administration. So this really serves as that backbone for EV charging infrastructure. And importantly here is that the NEVI program requires that states build out their AFCs before they can use those funds elsewhere. So that's an important part of our approach to utilizing the NEVI formula funds. So then what does this look like specifically in Virginia? So these are the AFCs, alt fuel corridors within Virginia. So 8 of them comprising just under 1,000 miles. And again, our focus early on is going to be that certification of being fully built out along these corridors, meeting those requirements, every 50 miles, within a mile of the interstate, et cetera. So then we move to the plan. There have been lots of questions and inquiries around this deployment plan in the recent months. So guidance came out in February of this year, and the plans were due August 1. So it was very fast and furious. Lots of sort of digesting the program requirements, seeking clarification, analyzing the data for our network in Virginia, and determining how we move forward. So I'm happy to say we did get our plan in time, which is good, because if a state chose not to submit a plan, then they don't have access to those formula funds. DOT has committed to approving all plans, working with the individual states, and then approving all plans by September 30th, if not before. And with that guidance that came out in February, there was also included a fairly robust template, and DOT indicated that they wanted states to adhere to that. They didn't want to have sort of creative approaches to developing a plan. So this slide just shows you the components of the deployment plan. So these were all sections that our plan and every state's plan had to build out. So it's quite a range there. And as you can imagine, with this initial plan, the level of specificity varies. So a lot of what we have in terms of content is higher level, but the idea is that these plans will be living documents, and states are anticipated to update them at least annually over the life of the program. So I just picked out one of those deployment plan visions and goals. So this is what we included in our plan, that we envision a charger network to facilitate that convenient, reliable, and equitable access to fast charging while spurring growth in this promising industry. So how we intend to do that is the 1, 2, 3 on the right. So again, we start by closing those gaps along AFCs and leveraging the funds in that manner so we can be certified as fully built out, while also maintaining reliability and connectivity. So the use of the funds, to be clear, does include many of these requirements, but we want to ensure that we meet or exceed those by establishing strict standards for measuring and reporting charging station uptime and maintaining station performance. So we don't want to just deploy the funds to install new stations or upgrade existing and then not have them be reliable investments for the traveling public. And then third, ensuring that equitable access. We really see the opportunity as we move past AFCs to other components of the network. That's where we really have an opportunity to make gains in this arena. But we also know that the AFCs themselves will help us in this arena. So we're being very intentional and looking at this and planning our path going forward on equitable access. Okay, so stakeholder engagement for something as aggressive as this, of course, stakeholder engagement is very key. And so these are four aspects that I wanted to touch on. I'll start with the federal level and just say that the Joint Office on Energy and Transportation, so that was spun up to support the NEVI program. And in all my years working with federal agencies, I've never seen something quite like this, where they came together very quickly, and they've been very responsive and very proactive in reaching out to states and engaging, asking how they can help, setting up at least monthly, if not more often, calls and webinars to assist states. So that's been a really positive experience. And then on the state front, of course, we've worked with the likely subjects. DEQ and Virginia Department of Energy have been great resources for us. And we've also engaged Virginia Clean Cities. So I wanted to acknowledge them. They're a nonprofit whose mission includes promoting alternative fuel use in the transportation sector. And they've been very helpful on the data and analysis side. For the public, you can see the website on the bottom of the slide. We set up that public site to post information that we hope will be useful. We hosted a public survey there, and we intend to do more. The current survey is closed, but we intend to post more there, as well as planning for future outreach and meetings. And then on the private side, there have been quite a lot of outreach, primarily through the Secretary's office with many of these entities. So I just list a few there, and we expect that to obviously increase as we move along. Okay, so with the alt fuel corridors in Virginia and the program requirements, what's the bottom line here? And we think this graphic well depicts that bottom line. So what you have here are locations where we believe we are fully built out. That's the blue. The orange represent gaps for potential new stations or station upgrades, again, where we're trying to meet those requirements of every 50 miles, a mile off the interstate, et cetera. And then we've also identified some exceptions. So those are places where an individual station does not meet the requirements, but we believe it's close to the intent, or combined with a neighboring station, they do meet the requirements. So DOT left the door open for states to propose exceptions. And so we've done that, and we understand that will get resolved before our plan is approved. Either those will be accepted or not. And so in general, while it doesn't line up, if you count the dots on the screen, we anticipate about 20 new stations or upgrades to existing stations to get us to fully built out along our AFCs. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't spend another minute or two on the equity considerations. This has been an area of discussion for sure, but I see it as an upcoming area of focus. A lot of DOTs are sharing, whether it be data sources, how to calculate benefits, how to approach outreach in this arena. So a lot of good work happening there. NEVI is designated by Federal Highway as a Justice 40 program. So what that means is that you have to demonstrate that 40% of the benefits are accruing to disadvantaged communities. So this is again a key area of focus that we're going to maintain as we move through the 5 years of the program. So NEVI planning phases, we really see 2 phases, and we're well into the first, which included nominating additional AFCs, those 8 that we talked about earlier. Initial outreach, but certainly plans for future outreach, ongoing outreach, developing the plan, which we've submitted, and then getting that certification built out on the AFCs. And then we're calling phase 2 just everything that comes next, the additional stakeholder engagement, being able to move off of the AFCs to corridors of statewide significance. So that's the map on the lower right. On the slide, we believe that our Virginia's corridors of statewide significance provide us really ample opportunity to get at community charging and those equity considerations. But of course, data and additional outreach will need to confirm that. And then, as I've already said, we do anticipate at least annual updates to the plan as we refine and move along. Okay, so as you might surmise, this is a very iterative process with, stakeholder engagement, fact finding, informing our initial plan deployment, and certainly the plan updates. Then we release, the funding opportunity and make those awards, and those awards then will help us to refine our stakeholder engagement and outreach, either around those new stations or new projects, as well as where we want to move next. And then that engagement, of course, then moves back into the next update of the plan. So truly, we see it as a very iterative process over the next 4 or so years. And then I wanted to briefly mention another opportunity for funding, and that's a discretionary grant program also authorized by IIJA. We're waiting on guidance for this, but we understand about $2.5 billion over the next 5 years. Of course, we're over a year into the program already. We understand it will be split in half, with half going to fill the gaps along AFCs, so much like the NEVI formula funds, but then the other half being specifically targeted to community charging grants. So to wrap it up, deployment plan approval by September 30th, if not before. We'll immediately move to putting out the initial funding opportunity for procurement of chargers. We'll seek that build out of our AFCs. It is our hope that the initial round of funding and awards will get us to built out, but we'll see. Ongoing stakeholder engagement and outreach, and then of course those annual updates to the plan as we move along. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Do you all see the screen?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So I'm Laura. I am based in Virginia, but my job on this panel is to briefly talk about other states and some national trends we're seeing, because we do work on different EV plans across the nation. So I'm not going to go into much of this because Angel has already done such an excellent job. One thing that I always think is a fun fact is often when we're starting to talk to people, they assume that the EV chargers will go in rest areas, where in fact, those are the places along the highways that are forbidden because of the history of the way the highway system was created. EV charging would count as commercialization of the rest area, and that is forbidden. So that is a topic that has come up a lot when we're talking through the EV charging station plans, especially with high-level folks like governors and moving down into the decisions that each state has to make. Also, as Angel said, we're talking about NEVI right now because the proposals are due and it's sort of a guiding framework, but tons of the funding in the IIJA and normal federal funding can be applied to EVs, either their planning, their construction, the actual charging, wayfinding to say on the highway, oh, the EV station is off this exit 2 miles or 1 mile, we hope, etc. So there's a lot of different ways this is being supported. All right, that's the background. Now let's talk about some other states. So the major trends we see are that most states are pushing towards a largely private ownership and private operating model for the stations, which is to say they're going to use matching to channel or use grant making to channel the federal and state dollars to the charging stations as opposed to developing or operating themselves. This is not universal. There are some states that are pursuing fully public or mixed model. And then most of those say they imagine it might migrate to a heavily private model over time. Still, other states are saying in general, it will be privately operated, but to achieve our Justice 40 goals, we don't want to rely on the private model to fulfill those because especially in the early years, it might not be as profitable. So public funds, even for operating the stations, may be concentrated on Justice 40 communities that the private sector might have trouble serving. So that's an example of the mixed model that other states are pursuing. Again, like Virginia, some other states already had comprehensive vehicle electrification or climate plans in place. And because of the availability of fundings, widely those are being adapted so that the language and the particular steps makes them eligible for NEVI and other IIJA funds. So that's a big trend of revising we see. And like Virginia, most states are focusing on AF completeness in phase 1. Now, I'll jump to the final bullet point. There are a bunch of states that are already complete. Their alternative fuel corridors already have stations every 50 miles. These tend to be very small states like Connecticut. So they are interested in me because their plans are already looking into what for most states like Virginia are phase 2 or phase 3 topics, such as community charging, corridors that are not officially AFCs, but are important statewide. So it is interesting to look at some of those states because they are going to be doing some of this comprehensive strategic planning work for what is phase 2 and phase 3 for the bigger states. So those might be some interesting ones to follow. And again, it tends to be those smaller states where just by having a few existing charging stations along their highways, they've essentially hit that goal of every 50 miles, 1 mile off the highway. Of course, at Streetlight, what we really see is data. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how data is being brought into all of this planning process. So first, the federal agencies did a great job when they put out the demand to turn these NEVI plans around so quickly in providing a lot of free data resources and organizing them at least with a bunch of links on one website. And we see a lot of states taking advantage, which is awesome. We also see tons of states using third-party data, stuff like Streetlight, not necessarily Streetlight. So we also like that because it's showing that people are saying, hey, to do this well, we need to be data-driven. We can't just sort of sprinkle stations without putting a lot of analysis into it. So the type of data that's being used to prioritize within the phase 1 AFC requirement, and I'll show you some examples, are a little different than the data conversation getting ready for the phase 2 requirements, which are about Justice 40 concerns. And like Virginia, what is really important is states need to consistently require data sharing in return from the private charging stations. There is a huge gap in knowledge nationally about, okay, you build stations, how often are they used? When are they used? What kind of cars use them? How many miles are charged? So when we were working with the feds before this bill was passed, they wanted this data when we were working on some analytics, and it's clear that nobody except the private companies really has it in a comprehensive way. So requiring data sharing back as part of getting grant money, I think is really, really critical for all states to do, because that is, the nation, we're sort of making a bet on what EV charging will look like nationally. And I bet it'll change from the early adopters today to the, adopters 10 years from now. So creating a data sharing framework is really important as part of this grant process. All right, so here's some quick examples. This is a screenshot from North Carolina's submission. So we're looking at, they have a lot of gaps in their network. And what they did is they ran analytics on different places that had the existing services and amenities to support an EV charging station, specifically the power to support a fast charging station. And they analyzed them in groups, and they used big data to say, okay, well, how many trips go by each of these potential locations? And what percent of the total trips in the area go by that location? And how long do those trips tend to stop? If they're making a stop, is it like a 2-minute stop or is it like an hour stop that might be more amenable to charging? And they organized all this data about each potential area. This is a summary table, but the data is available sort of exit ramp by exit ramp. This helped them direct their own funding strategy, but also this data will be made available to the private bidders to help the private bidders estimate how much money they could expect to make at this location versus that location with different charging station configurations. So this is an example of data being used by the state itself for the macro strategy and then being provided to try to facilitate the charging station providers being as successful as possible. So that's a nice 1 + 1 = 3 use of data. Indiana did a similar set of analytics on all of their areas. This is a map they made. I think the more dark red and bigger it is, that's where you're seeing existing dwell sessions, which means that cars are getting off and stopping for a while. 3 hours is like lunch or spending the night. So again, they were using these vehicle characteristics to help think about where along these corridors, sort of beyond the just stopping them every 50 miles, where is a station likely to be the most successful and therefore the most used. What both North Carolina and Indiana were doing with this data is also thinking forward to phase 2. Where are they, and this is a big part of North Carolina's, where are there stations that would match the AFC goals, every 50 miles, 1 mile off the highway, but that would also be very useful to locals, right? Trying to get a double win out of a station investment, both for your long distance travelers up and down the highway and just folks living nearby who might not have a home charging station because maybe they live in a place where you street park like I did. All right, Ohio has done some similar analytics. And again, they put all their analytics in this interactive dashboard, which again, I think is meant to facilitate the private sector, sort of urge them to make the decisions Ohio wants them to make, but also help them make smart decisions by being data informed. So it's a way to coordinate all the different public actors. So that is a cool thing to do. And they have organized their charging bids in corridors. So what you can see is here's the map of where you'd be in the sort of 1 mile zone if you covered this gap on the corridor. Some other interesting tidbits. Alabama has put a separate prioritization rubric on their alternative fuel corridors, which is also prioritizing upgrades on evacuation routes. Alabama is increasingly, like a lot of the southeastern states, being hit by hurricanes. So thinking about charging stations on evacuation routes, which I think mirrors the way they think about gas station permitting on evacuation routes. It's an interesting element that they had. California is one of those states, I think like Ohio, where bidders won't bid on stations or locations. You have to bid on a whole corridor and then complete the corridor. So that's putting a little more planning work, pushing it a little further down into the private sector. And they're one of the states that is considering doing their own public operation for less economically viable locales. Texas and actually Wyoming have both defined rural as just fundamentally part of Justice 40. Rural is fundamentally disadvantaged. So they're also trying to accelerate deployment in rural areas. And Wyoming is actually challenging the whole alternative fuel corridor concept and saying they think that even though they weren't designated corridors initially, their stations should go on routes to state and national parks because that's where they think the most charging will occur. So that's an interesting tactic that they're taking. And in Indiana, I would say reading between the lines, realized that maybe they should have, the alternative fuel corridors have been developed over years. Indiana is realizing that by not emphasizing that and putting in the work over years to get a lot of corridors in Indiana so designated, they are not getting as much money. So they are also quickly trying to add more corridors within their state. So there's some interesting other trends we see working across the different states. And every day, more and more state plans get finalized and posted. So there's more information coming out to see what others are doing all the time. I think now we are moving on into questions.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience? I don't see the chat box.
I see it, but I don't see any chats in it.
Okay, I see it now. So we'll just wait a minute, see, do we have any questions? If you have any questions, please enter it in the chat box there. I guess while we're waiting too, while we're waiting, so is Virginia planning on adding charging stations to parks as well?
Not at this time, and we haven't closed the door on those opportunities. Our focus is, again, building out the AFCs and then looking at the corridors of statewide significance. Certainly, keenly focused on the Justice 40 requirements and objectives there. So I just think naturally, some of those conversations will come up. I know we've had the conversations about rest areas that Laura mentioned as well. And I think the guidance coming from the federal government is going to change a bit over time as these things, result in asks, if you will, from the state. So, so not planning it right now, but certainly not closed off to it either.
Okay. All right, we do have a couple questions. Do you anticipate any significant environmental concerns or effects?
Well, I'll start. I'm sure Brad or Laura may have some other input, but I'll just start by saying we don't anticipate that, or we imagine most will be on already disturbed property, if you will, but NEPA is a required component of utilization of these funds, so there will be a NEPA review associated with each, if that helps.
Okay, what provisions are in the newly passed IRA that would accelerate implementation?
I haven't the full breakdown, but in the IRA, there's a lot more about incentivizing the purchasing of vehicles, whereas the IIJA, which was very focused on infrastructure, had more incentives for this charging infrastructure. So I think that's a really necessary partnership, because if we have lots of charging stations, but the vehicles don't get adopted as quickly as we want, then it's not accelerating electrification of transportation. So I think that's the main new thing in the new bill, is the support for education and subsidization of getting the vehicles purchased and out there driving to use all these charging stations.
Yeah, exactly. Currently, there is a $7,500 up to a $7,500 federal tax rebate you can get on electric vehicles for manufacturers that are within a certain cap. Now, unfortunately, I think Tesla, Chevy, and Toyota have already hit their cap, so you can no longer get that tax rebate or tax credit on those vehicles. So what the new IRA has is it's reinstating the $7,500 tax credit for all manufacturers. However, the caveat is that the vehicles have to be primarily manufactured in the U.S. and they have to obtain their the components of the batteries from free trade nations, and that's the catch point right now. Is not many do. So we're thinking it's going to be about a year before we see vehicles that will become eligible for this new tax credit. But once they do, that's really going to help incentivize purchasing.
And I also think it's really important for getting buy-in, because when you look at the charging plans from certain states, particularly southern states, it is very explicitly tied to investments in vehicle manufacturing, specifically in Alabama, Tennessee, some of the places where the new Build American provisions have really benefited. So it's really, I think, locking down on that framework for the economic benefits of the green economy, as well as the environmental benefits of the green economy to these states.
Okay. So who typically pays for the power at public charging stations, and how is that affecting the growth of stations?
In our experience working with charging station providers, not realizing how hard and expensive it is to do the interconnect is the #1 reason stations get level 3 stations, these big fast stations that we're talking about, get delayed. So it is a hugely important topic and one of the reasons that some of the plans filter on where you might not have to do massive interconnection build outs. But in terms of who usually pays, I don't know of a usual.
Mm.
Like
Okay.
sometimes it's the utility, sometimes it's like the Walmart that's hosting it. I don't know if there is a usual in my experience, but y'all might know more.
Okay, so has there been any policy for emergency preparedness vehicles like AAA or VDOT assistant vehicles in accommodating EV?
So I can take this one, and Angel, feel free to chime in. But when we were doing research for the Virginia Electric Vehicle Readiness Study, AAA actually did a pilot where they had portable chargers on their assistance vehicles, and they discontinued it because there wasn't demand. They weren't finding electric vehicles stranded on the side of the road. One of the recommendations that we had for our readiness study is that, Virginia needs to just monitor the conditions and see if there is demand, if there is a need for portable charging, because we do have vendors out there that are working on portable level 2 chargers. So as those portable chargers come online and can provide, more rapid roadside charging, that becomes viable. But as it stands now, we just had a recommendation to monitor and see if there's a need, because as of yet, it hasn't proven to be a need.
Okay, it's interesting. Okay, so does the driver have to pay for charging? If so, what is the cost to charge an EV?
I think that was included in Brad's total cost of ownership, right?
Yeah, we had about 4 cents a mile as part of the total cost of ownership. And of course the charge for electricity, just like gasoline, is variable depending on the rates at the time. So it also is dependent on the vehicle and what size battery capacity it has. So it's a hard question to answer, but the short answer is it's more affordable than gas. But again, it can be different depending on which week you're charging your vehicle.
So as an example, at 4 cents a mile, my EV, which gets the tank of my EV is 250 miles. That's less than $10 for a full tank.
Oh, wow. Okay, we have time for one last question. Can you break out the vehicle sales by city?
You can break out the vehicle ownership, the registrations by locality. There is a website that the name is escaping me, but if you Google it, you can find that information. It's out there and readily available. And I'd be happy to look up that website, and I can share it with Muriel if she wants to follow up.
Yeah, sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, we'll be happy to pass that along if you send it to me.
Mhm.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. This was very informative. I really appreciate your time, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. That concludes our program. I hope everyone has a good afternoon, and we hope to see everyone next month at our annual reception. Have a good afternoon.